to Growing with the Stars, where we use astrology to help you live your best life. And we also love to nerd out on various historical topics. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about Jewish history, which is something that is my background. Not just a traditional astrologer, I'm also a practicing traditional egalitarian Jew. And we're going to be taking a look at what are the trends in Jewish history astrologically, going back a very long time. And this is probably part one of a couple part episodes, and what these trends can then tell us about what we should be expecting moving forward. I think, really, especially in the upcoming 10 to 15 years, because let me tell you, it's pretty loud. So, yeah, welcome. I'm Katie, and this is my partner in crime.
And I am Kat, and I am here kind of to learn along with you guys today. I am not practicing the Jewish faith. I actually have uh, been Catholic, but I'm no longer practicing. So that's about as close as I get to religion at this time. However, very beautiful religion. Really excited to learn more about it as we go. My background is more kind of in this. I did do some schooling towards a degree in historical studies. Unfortunately, due to disability, I wasn't able to complete it. However, I did learn some very useful things from some very fantastic teachers. So I did take and apply the things that I learned in that schooling to kind of put together like references and things like that for the sources that Katie provided us with. And she's given us some really, really like lush documentation, some really beautiful information to work on, and I'm really excited to sit through this today, learn along with you, maybe ask some questions at the end after she gives us all the information that we are going to learn today. I'm really, really stoked. So thank you so much, Katie, for doing this for us.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited about it. I think when we often talk about astrology, we think about it as an individual practice, a birth chart, me, myself, and I. And there's a whole part of astrology. There's so many strains of it. And there's a real large piece that we can do as we're navigating the crazy times that we are in to look at socio-political world events. So sometimes this is called world astrology, sometimes it's called mundane astrology. And I want to, there's a lot of ways you can take this. And while this topic is really vast, I wanted to focus this series first off on pivotal historical moments in Jewish history. And I do have a bias as being an Ashkenazi Jew myself. My background is mostly from Eastern Europe, of focusing on momentous events that, as I know that through the Eastern European lens. I think that this is going to be a jumping off point for lots of astrologers, especially other Jewish astrologers, to further refine as we go. Because there are, in case you don't know, there are a lot of subgroups within Judaism, right? We're not just one monolith. There are Ashkenazi Jews, which is the Eastern European kind. There's the Sephardic Jews, which are people that have come from the Spanish region and then the exile in 1492, as well as a major group called the Mizrahim, which is often from North Africa and the Middle East. And there are many other groups with specific subcultures and probably are going to have some different astrological sensitivities. And some of the trickiness that we're kind of dealing with today is, what do you look at astrologically when there's no one chart to go off of, right? Judaism is pretty old. Right? By 2000 years ago, we'd already had two temples. Um, there was already a large body of content, literature, traditions, and practices. And so we don't have a lot of like documentation around when all of this started. We have a lot of gaps that would make it astrologically nearly impossible to say, here's the birth chart of Judaism. But we can use looking at major historical events within a group or within a community to then identify potentially major transits or trends to be watching. And one of the really nice things about the Jewish community, Jewish history, is that we have over 2,500 years of history, right? That is different levels of documentation to do an exploration. And so the TLDR is what I did is I wanted to look through at major, what I would call kind of like tier one um, events in Jewish history and looking at these pivotal moments to see what was coming up astrologically at those times, to see if there are patterns. I do think there are patterns, but this is an initial exploration. As I said, there is a bit of a bias towards the Ashkenazi European experience. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for other folks to dive deeper, looking at maybe, more minor events that we can catalog or have a better delineation on what kinds of trends are going to then forecast to different sort of things. Um, and this wasn't a solo project at all. Um, Big shout out to astro.com and their Swiss Ephemeris, which goes back millennia, which was critical for me to be able to generate charts on this. And Duna Holler, as well, is an incredible astrologer in Spain who did a lot of the initial edits and reviewed the blog post that I have on this topic, also on my website, um, and really just kind of checked me before I went off running my mouth.
My only question for you would be, what would you define as a tier one um,
Yeah.
event?
So I think of these as sort of major pivotal moments that sort of would change. When you're looking at Judaism too, it's also a really, it doesn't really, it defies a lot of sort of religious ideas of what we think of as a religion today. It sort of is an ethno group. There is a religion, there is a cultural practices, there is a conversion practice, there's complexities that highlight that it's not just sort of one thing. And so I wanted to look at events that, um, when I say tier one, I would say are, if you were to walk up to almost any Jewish person, would say these were major moments in Jewish history. These were pivotal shifts in Jewish social political life. Um, and so it's things like the fall of both of the temples. I would say also the rise of the Maccabees, the sort of what we would call the Hasmonean period. We're looking at mostly ancient stuff today. Um, to sort of see what trends we see as sort of these major shifts that you can say, yes, definitely something really critical is happening here. Um, Versus maybe tier two, tier three, the average person might not remember that as well. They might be like, oh, yes, that is related to this, which is why it's important. But it doesn't necessarily stand on its own as a critical moment.
What would be, by comparison, like a tier two or a tier three, just to give an example to our audience, something just briefly?
Yeah, like a tier two or a tier three, if we're looking at like the ancient period, I might be like, okay, when did Herod start really building up the second temple? This is an important moment in the history. It has important moments for like we can talk about building in the temple, but like, is it a critical turning point or not? Meh. So maybe a tier two or that would be more well known, but is maybe less pivotal is the siege of Masada. So this is also during the war with Rome, and you have a bunch of sort of these extreme holdouts who go up to Masada, which is was like a king's castle in the desert, and basically are able to stay up there for months until the Romans create a rampart to go up there, and then they do kind of communal suicide. And so that's an important moment, but is it like a critical turning point in the larger Jewish social political context? Not necessarily. So we're looking at the ancient Judea period, so really before you have what we would call the modern diaspora communities, for the most part. This is through the lens of what an Ashkenazi Jewish person as myself might see as some of the major moments. There might be some other moments that maybe somebody who is like from the Persian Jewish community might want to emphasize that is missing here, right? Because the Persian Jewish community is actually one of the oldest diaspora communities. Or there might be some context from like a Sephardic perspective that um, they might want to be bringing in, and especially in the next part as we go into the medieval history period. So I just want to acknowledge that like I'm probably having some biases. There's probably some events that you would love to look at. And I just want to say that this is an initial exploration and that there's so much more opportunity and space for further research, further insight, um, and for others to kind of join in and help flesh this out to create better insight, not just for what's going to impact all Jews, but like different Jewish groups as we are a widespread and diverse community. So let's dive in to the very beginning. And what I want to start with is the fall of the first temple. And this is critical because this is the first Jewish exile. So the Babylonian diaspora, the Persian Jewish community originates from this period. And we see an end of the first Jewish ethno state, right? When Jews were kind of in the land and sort of self-ruling. And this is a major moment religiously as well as sort of ideologically because we get a lot of like the prophetic literature that is quoted all the time comes from this time frame, as well as like some of the Psalms. So like Psalm 137 comes from this. You've probably heard the Bob Marley song of "By the Rivers of Babylon," and that comes from this song. This psalm, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion." And so this is really important, but the problem is um, we're not exactly sure what exact year this happened. And it could have been either 587 BCE or 586. Now, let's just take a look at 587 to start. About, I think August 1st was the date that I used and pulled all of these placements through the Ephemeris so that we could visualize it. And what's really striking is we see a lot of cardinal energy. Uranus is retrograde, but still in Aries. We have Neptune and Jupiter in Aries. And we have throughout that summer, right? Saturn is in Cancer. Mars has been in Cancer for at least a couple of weeks, and Venus is just about to enter Cancer. Um, this is some major cardinal activation, and the day that I happen to pull this up, we also have the moon. So this creates during that time frame what we call a cardinal T-square. So the moon is opposing Saturn loosely to Mars, and they're both the moon and Mars are squaring Neptune. So this is starting a pattern that we're going to see a lot of today, which is cardinal signs and cardinal T-squares. Before I forget, there's some other things that are also happening this summer that's very interesting. So about 2 weeks before this chart, we also have a solar eclipse in Cancer. So once again, that is major cardinal energy activation, and it's within 4 degrees of a square to Neptune. So once again, we're seeing even more cardinal activation between Aries, Cancer going on. But let's just say it happened in 586. All right. So this chart still has some of that loose cardinal activation. There is some fixed sign stuff going on by then, right? We see um, also like an August 1st timeline, but we're still seeing Uranus and Neptune, these outer planets in Aries, and we're still seeing Saturn at the tail end of Cancer. Things have moved into some of the fixed signs by this point, but cardinal energy is happening no matter which year we are looking at. So just some things to keep in mind. So the next moment we're going to be talking about is the Maccabean Revolt. So this is 167 BCE, if you want numbers. And if you've probably heard of this story, it's really the story of Hanukkah. Um, and this is a time frame where people are kind of fighting for their identity. There's this sort of fight against the Greeks. You'll hear a lot about sort of the miracle of light. But let's talk about it historically. And so at this time frame, we're seeing a resistance to Hellenization, and there's a move for national independence. We're not exactly, once again, at least as far as I could tell, we don't have an exact date, but we do know that December of that year, so December 167 BCE, was a major moment because the Greek rulers of the region at the time, they brought in foreign idols and what was called cultic prostitution to the Second Temple, which was seen as a massive affront to Jewish practice and polluting the temple, which is theologically within Judaism of the time an incredible no-no. There is a lot of rules, there's a lot of rigor around proper practice and purification that is supposed to happen before you go into the temple. One of the major things is, washing yourself. And there is a whole thing around sexual relations and sexual fluids that needs to be cleansed and purified before you even step on the grounds. So let's look at an example chart for this date. And so just to make it really easy on ourselves, I was like, all right, let's pull up December 1st, 167 BCE. And once again, the trends are trending. So once again, we are seeing uh, we see Jupiter and Saturn are over in Libra. So once again, we have cardinal activation. It's a little bit different, right? Uranus is back in Aries, very early degrees. And this whole month, what's quite interesting is we have both Venus and Mars in Capricorn. And something that I didn't mention earlier is that with outer planet alignments, like things like Uranus, but even like Saturn and Jupiter, which are a little bit faster than the truly outer planets, is we often see things like Mars, the moon, Mercury being triggers. They sort of combust, they sort of are the spark that activates the larger lineup. And so one of the things we might be seeing here is both the moon acting as that combustion, the day of December 1st, and later in the month, right? Mars reaching 8 degrees, even earlier, maybe 4 degrees, and acting as that combustion point as well. So that would be a T square, a proper T square between Uranus, Jupiter, and then Mars as it gets to about 4 degrees. The other thing to really bring up that is going to, I think, show up more and more as we talk is Pluto in Aquarius, right? Pluto in Aquarius is starting to show up in these charts, and there are some real trends that I think also are going to show up with that. So just let's see when and how Pluto is showing up with these sort of pivotal events. Also, finally, the other thing I forgot to mention is we see eclipses again with this moment. December 6th, there was a lunar eclipse in the Sagittarius Gemini axis. So it wasn't in the cardinal signs, but by then, that is when Mars would have been at the apex point. So it would have been similar to where Venus was in that chart. So there would have been both an eclipse and a cardinal T square. So what's very interesting is this is kicking off a major fight for Jewish rights, a major change in Jewish political identity that ultimately leads to the restoration of Jewish rights. And that critical moment is October 15th, 164. And that's when the Hellenistic rulers, the Greeks that we were talking about earlier, make major concessions. And there's a formal end to the revolt. There's still some fighting, but there's a lot of what's considered freedom in sort of being able to practice and do their thing. And so, really interestingly, on this chart, and something I think to look into further. So, this, let's spread you out. So, this is the chart for the day of the concession. And so Pluto in Aquarius is making major aspects in this chart. We see Pluto in Aquarius in a tight T square with Mars. The moon is separating from Mars, and both Pluto and Mars are squaring Venus. Uh, and so we're not actually seeing a lot of cardinal energy. There is the Sun Uranus opposition, you know, which is striking, but not a lot of cardinal energy, which is very interesting. So this is right the moment of culmination and not the beginning. And astrologically, something to keep in mind is that beginning charts or when things are initiated are very important versus when something is finished. But even still, I think that there's something to look into as far as fixed sign energy here. Final thing I want to say is also it feels like I'm kicking a dead horse, but not just that we had all the fixed sign stuff the day of the restoration, we also had another eclipse. That eclipse was 12 days before the restoration, and it was in Libra and Aries. So there is also cardinal activation again. So eclipses keep coming up right around these major moments, whether it's not exactly on the major moment, but it's around the major moment. And we're seeing some really interesting trends with both T squares as well as cardinal signs. The final one I want to talk about today is the great Jewish revolt. So you might hear it as that. You might hear it as the war against Rome. Um, you might know it as Rome conquering Jerusalem, and you might have seen Titus's art where we see the depiction of Roman soldiers carrying a menorah. They're carrying sort of the things that were looted back into Rome. I can't state enough how much this moment, and of course, my cat Dusk is agreeing with me. Uh, this moment, the events that happen here, change Jewish life as we knew it. This event, right, this revolt against Rome and being sort of being a kind of client state of Rome at the time, it destroys the temple. And this ends critical Jewish infrastructure, right? It ends the temple sacrifice and it sets up the foundation for what's called rabbinic Judaism. A lot of the Judaism that you see today, its seeds were fermenting during this time frame. We see it as early as, we see a lot of that as well with the time of Jesus, and you'll see a lot of stuff about Pharisees. I have a lot of mixed feelings about that and how that's portrayed, but that's a whole other discussion. Um, but it begins a kind of Judaism that is practiced, that has evolved and practiced today. And it really begins the diaspora and sort of the Jewish subgroups and communities that are also define a lot of what's happened today. And they've never really ended, right? There has been shifts with the state of Israel and sort of migration there in the 20th century, but the revolt and the failure of the revolt defines is the defining feature that changes Jewish life for thousands of years. So the earliest information that I could find, and if you have better data, I would love to see it, was that fighting really begins in 66 May CE. Uh, and I'm pulling up a chart that I pulled for like the very beginning of the month. I wanted to see, okay, where were things at? And this is what I was seeing. So what's interesting is we don't have a cardinal T square at this point. We will probably have it by the end of the month as Venus enters Cancer. Once again, Pluto is back in Aquarius. Interesting. We see Uranus this time is up in Capricorn, and we see Jupiter and Neptune in Aries. Now it's loose, but it's Uranus is moving backwards towards Jupiter and Neptune. So there is this square, there is some of this tension that is already coming up. That Neptune Uranus square by the end of May is within 2 degrees. And we have a Jupiter Neptune conjunction exactly on May 12th, May 13th. So outer planet cardinal activity is going nuts. It's not the moment, but it is a critical starting point for this tier one event. And so that's why I wanted to take a look at it. The real ball busting moment, if you want to talk about it that way, or the real tier one of tier one moments when we're talking about the Great Revolt is the siege of Jerusalem. Now, if you talk to a lot of folks, if you talk to a lot of Jews, we talk about the fall of the temple itself. And that is usually seen as in the summer, at least theologically, cultural memory. We think of it as Tisha B'Av, the ninth day of Av, which would be sometime in either July or August. But the siege itself, and astrologically, what we're going to care about with this siege is when the siege begins, because astrology always tells us that the beginning of something is the critical point. That tells us how something's going to end. And I literally could not make up this chart if I tried. This chart is bananas. The siege starts during Passover. Passover is always around a full moon, typically. And during this time frame, you would have a lot of folks come to Jerusalem. They would be pilgrims and they would bring offerings. So what's really fucked up about the siege is not just that it happened, but Lots of people got stuck in Jerusalem who weren't trying to be there for that. They were trying to like bring an offering to the temple and then get stuck in Jerusalem. So this is the chart. Now, this is striking for a lot of reasons. It's bringing together a whole bunch of things that we've been talking about. We're talking eclipses. So, right, we're getting uh, the North and South Node in Aries and Libra. We're getting a cardinal T square. We're getting outer planets, right? We've got Saturn in Libra, Neptune in Aries, and they're both in a loose square, tightening over time with Jupiter in Cancer. Add on top of that, Pluto is still in Aquarius, and Uranus is in a pretty tight sextile to Mars, which isn't something that haven't talked about as much, but Uranus and Mars are the chaos goblins of the sky. When they are working together, things get combustible. And so this chart is screaming to me the patterns we've been talking about all day today, right? Cardinal signs, T squares, outer planets, and eclipses, and major changes in political social life, right? Major rise or major fall. And in this case, we're seeing a major fall in the political social life of Jews, right? They are forced into exile, they are forced to disperse, they no longer have the kind of cultural center. And that is really, really striking. There are other things about this chart that I also want to bring up. And this is in relation to what we know about Titus. He becomes emperor. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about other major players in Jewish history, but the trends of this are very interesting. So he's the general who leads this campaign. And part of his success in leading this campaign and overthrowing, right, or in quelling the rebellion, as it would be called, is how much his chart is locked in with some of this energy. So, right, I want to do a side-by-side comparison of, let's do a side-by-side comparison of Vespasian and the day uh, they start the siege of Jerusalem. Now, I also want to highlight this might also have been very intentional because astrology was very popularly, wildly used during this time frame. And it was widely used by very powerful people. Um, so let's take a look at these two charts because not only is it really interesting that we see how Jerusalem fell in the astrology, but I want to look at Vespasian. And Vespasian, you might know him as an emperor, but he's also the major military Roman force behind uh, why Jerusalem falls. He starts off quelling the rebellion, and it's his son, Titus, who finishes the siege. But it's really this success here that allows Vespasian to become emperor and to be seen as very successful. The first thing I want to look at is the fact that this man has the Jupiter Saturn square between Cancer and Libra, and he's in his second Jupiter return. Or not second Jupiter, every time I say this, his second Saturn return. In your second Saturn return, so at the end of your 50s to early 60s, you also have a Jupiter return. And so his natal promise of this, you know, tightening Jupiter Saturn square is also echoing in this chart. When the natal promise is echoed like that, you want to take notice. Add in the fact that this man has Mars in Capricorn at 4 degrees. That would be in an incredibly tight square and an overcoming square to Mars in Aries. So we see him creating additional stressors in this moment. His birth chart, kind of in an overlapping moment, creates additional powerful stressors and an ability to really overcome in this moment. And sort of we see his success. And also, an interesting tidbit, which is, can the trends of major moments also be an indicator of potential folks who are going to be very pivotal in Jewish history? His chart has some very interesting echoes. Now, it's really the Jupiter Saturn square and a little bit with Mars, but he's not like all cardinal, right? He's a Taurus rising. He's got that Scorpio sun. The man was probably really fucking stubborn. Would not want to get into an argument with him, but something to be kind of looking into, which is, do these trends, these transits, also echo with people? And will that be something for us to look into as well? So that's like what I have for today, where we're seeing a lot of major. I was really struck looking at this, seeing a lot of these cardinal squares. Pluto and Aquarius brings up some really interesting stuff for us to think about, which is just major changes in Jewish status. We saw both really positive changes, right? The rise in more political power and authority and sort of self authority. And we also see the loss of that. So it's not super clear to me when Pluto is doing what. I think doing some deeper work with Pluto and Aquarius and then where Saturn is might be really interesting. I think it's especially interesting to see what happens with Pluto and Aquarius when Saturn is exalted in Libra and is in a trine to Pluto. Something to certainly watch for as we go through our own Pluto and Aquarius period. And oh God, I mean, we're about 12 years from dealing with Saturn in Libra, but it is going to come. So those are just some early thoughts about what I'm seeing. Yeah, I don't know if anything was sticking out to you, Kat.
I mean, like that's a lot of history. Actually, it was what you were talking about with Vespasian and that chart particularly was fascinating because like I I in theory, right, like or know that like in practice like astrology was practiced, right? But you're like I mean, it's very possible that they even looked at this chart before they did the thing and like I wouldn't have even put those two things together. So that was one of those things where I was like that makes a lot of sense. So following my question is are we covering um Titus is going to be our next guy. Is that going to be where we're going into next time?
Actually, I have not looked into Titus, but let me just see if I can pull him up really quickly. I don't know if we have a good um, a good time chart for Titus. So let's take a look at Titus for a second. So this is the son of Vespasian. We don't have a great time chart for him. So definitely take the moon. The moon was probably in Scorpio, unless he was born really late that day. The thing that is very interesting is that he was creating additional tension with the eclipse chart. So look at all of this stuff in Capricorn. We're talking Mercury. So Mercury would have been in a tight square as well to Mars. The sun was in a tight, basically his sun was in what's called the nodal bends. So this real pivotal shifting point around his own leadership is happening as he's doing this siege. And I think the fact that he gets a triumph after the siege, this is incredibly important politically in Rome. When you get a triumph, this is a big ass deal, and it really shows off your own might, your own power, your own success. So that is incredibly critical. And maybe the most important thing that I'm seeing in his chart, which is really interesting, two things. His Mars in Capricorn would have been in a perfect grand cross with the T square, right? That 23 degrees of Mars, Jupiter was at 24 degrees of Cancer that day. And so would have created that perfect four-way tie between Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. Also, he was in his Saturn return and Saturn almost to the exact point, which is really, really fascinating. So, multiple people were having incredibly tense moments. I wish we had a better time chart for him, but he definitely at least also has a cardinal square, which I think lots of folks probably have cardinal squares. And so I don't want to say, oh, this person, if you have a cardinal square or have big cardinal placements, means that you're definitely going to be important in Jewish history. But I think it's something to certainly kind of keep in mind as we look at trends of these sort of major players. And we are missing what I would love to see is his ascendant, his midheaven. Those might also be critical degrees that then create other information about that would either align or disprove this theory, right? And that's, I think, just something to keep in mind that I would love that data. Yeah.
Someone please go out and dig up the pottery sherd for us. If you can find with the birth time on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind is lots of powerful folks historically did not want anyone to know their birth information. If you worked with and believed in astrology historically, and you were a powerful figure like an emperor or a major general, people could use that against you. And people have done that. And so it could be that we won't ever know, or it was intentionally obscured for some of those reasons. It's why being an astrologer, you had to work for power historically, because otherwise you were not let, you weren't kept around for them to find out if you're going to do something else. So these are just some of the trends that we are seeing historically. Uh, I'm really fascinated by it. We're going to continue to look at the medieval period next time, and then I'm hoping we can do a whole one on the modern era, where that will be really the 1700s to today, and that's really when we're going to start looking at things coming up. But if you have your sort of astrological antennas are tweaking, because right, we're in Pluto and Aquarius. We just had eclipses in Aries and Libra. We are having major outer planets in cardinal signs right now. The echoes are certainly echoing, and there's definitely some important moments, I think, to come.
Always more to come. That's how history it does. It keeps on historying. So that's freaking fascinating. I am looking forward to our next installment. So what are we covering? You said,
Next time, we're going to focus on the medieval period. I want to focus on some of the Crusades. It's also going to include the Spanish expulsion, as well as some major moments in Catholic law, sort of the Catholic, when the Catholic cardinals would gather and they would make some major moments that had major legal impacts on Jews within Europe. So that episode's going to be a little more Europe focused. That's the history that I know better, and so can at least say with more of my chest than just spitballing. And then we're going to also talk about some of the important players, especially Queen Isabella, Ferdinand and Isabella, whose charts are really, really interesting to look at. Uh, Deeply problematic, deeply powerful people, and we're going to see that in those charts. And then I think after that, that's a good chunk of, 16, 1700 years of history. We're then going to have a third, I think, episode talking about the modern era. That'll look at like the 1800s until today and sort of looking ahead at some major moments that I think we should all be kind of keeping an eye on for pivotal shifts. Yeah.
if we wanted to, where could we find your original article?
Yeah, we're gonna link it below, but it is also on my website under katieannastrology.com/blog. And you're gonna be looking, it's about 4 or 5 articles back at this point for Jewish history. I think it's major moments in Jewish history, or the astrology of major moments in Jewish history. So we'll link to that below if you want to take a read at it, get a sneak peek of what we're going to be talking about next time. There's lots of charts, lots of links, and truly have to once again give a shout out to Duna Holler, who we will also link below. Shout out to their work for making sure all of my data was good so that we could speak to this today in pretty accurate and strong terms. The last thing I ever want to do is give you all bad info. So if there's anything you thought we missed, anything you think there was an oversight on, please let us know in the comments. The other thing in those charts that we were trying to do as well is make sure we were correcting the Julian Gregorian issues do come up where the site that I used to generate charts, astro-seek.com, is Gregorian for obvious reasons if you're looking at modern dates. But the siege of Jerusalem is in the Julian calendar. And so making sure that we had those correct dates and the correct astrology was also part of it. So if you see some stuff like that, that might also be what we're dealing with. But would always love thoughts, feels, comments, ideas.
And if anybody wanted to book a reading with you, same website?
The same website, you can read my blog, you can book a reading with me. It's all there. Would love to take a look at your chart, dig into your personal history, and help you with whatever's coming your way, or just help you make the most of your life with the natural assets and attributes that you already have.
Okay. And then just so everybody knows, we did kind of put together a timeline for this episode. So we'll go ahead and we'll link that down below in the description section for you. You can kind of scroll through and see, the charts and everything. Kind of, it's a very, just brief timeline of what we discussed today, as well as images of the charts we looked at, which also link out to the Astro website that houses them. If you have any other questions, please hit us up in the comments below. Give us a like, a share, subscribe to show your support. That would be fantastic. We're really happy to have you. So, anything else you want to leave us with today, Katie?
Just thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.